Next up, I'd like to invite Don Kwan.
Okay, wow, that was amazing, Elliot. That incredible. Yeah, I was in the back and everything just was resonating. Thank you, everyone, Jacqueline, Paul, Henry, and for inviting me to speak at this presentation. It's quite an honor for me. I just arrived back from Vancouver this morning, so I'm a little bit jet lagged, but my trip to Vancouver was so eye-opening and being born and raised here in Ottawa, coming from a family that is 3 generations here in Ottawa. I'll explain a little bit about myself. So I'm a queer 3rd generation Chinese Canadian visual artist. My family have been settlers here for 100 years. This November 30th, my grandfather arrived back in 1922. Paid the head tax, landed in Vancouver, paid the head tax, traveled across Canada, and eventually settled here in Ottawa. I'm a visual artist, so I'll walk you through like some slides and it'll be more visual, and I'll go along explaining each piece. I love objects that are very familiar to us. I find they're very simple ways for the audience or the public to kind of engage and invite themselves into the conversation. Here, there's a VHS tape. If no one knows what a VHS tape is in this room, you don't have to raise your hand. It's called Video Home System, right? If you remember, there were little tabs on the sides, and if you had some music video or a home movie recorded on it, and you didn't want anyone to tape over it, you would notch those tabs. So here, this piece is called Chinese Canadian History. Please do not erase. So this becomes an artifact in like an art artifact in the canon of art history, but it also is part of historical lost technology. So there's a lot of layers to this piece. But for me, as a 3rd generation, my grandfather paid the head tax. I watched my parents, running a family-run business. I saw them experience a lot of racism in their growing up. And then I went to school. I went to Jesuits, Winston Churchill. I took the history class. I tried to excel. My parents really tried to encourage us to assimilate and excel at becoming Canadian. So I did all that. So now that I'm older and I'm a little bit wiser, I have more connection to my heritage. So I find that I really try and reconcile what I peel away from what I learn. So I dropped out of art college to help my family business back in the mid-90s. And that didn't stop me from educating myself or pursuing my art career. I just took a different path. And that path kind of led me organizing, running the family business pretty much full-time, 7 days a week. Not inheriting my parents' kind of work ethic, which was 18 hours a day. My generation, we kind of reduced it down to 12 hours a day. And then later on, it became 5 days a week. And then my parents became older and very much like early Chinese or embedded in our culture is, we cherish and honor our elders. We respect our ancestors through ceremony, through action. So often households are multi-generational. You'll have your grandmother living with you, you'll have your parents living with you, and then so on and so on. So here I love the word please because it kind of suggests like a courtesy, but also like a desperation because of the lost histories. So I love the fact that we're here, and I'm starting with this image in the archives. So so I was in Vancouver because I have a solo exhibit at the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens. I was invited by Paul Wong to feature my art as a queer Asian artist. Paul Wong, I have a great history with him. When I was growing up and I first went to the National Gallery of Canada after leaving OCAD art school, I never really saw myself in institutions, like reflected in institutions. So back in the 90s, when I went through the National Gallery, there were several artists that really resonated and spoke to me. One was Paul Wong, and he did this piece called Intensity. So representation really matters. And I learned that at a very young age. So it's really nice to hear like institutions 50 years, 30, 40, 50 years later, creating these mandates to capture our stories, to allow these communities to be seen and be heard. A lot of my work is autobiographical. It's very personal. I find art is a great tool, a very delicate tool to kind of begin a conversation, but also a healing process. So I never knew my grandfather, and if you look closely, the head tax certificate, there's a portrait of him. He's 11 years old, and it was 1922 when he arrived here in Canada from Vancouver. And then you can imagine November 30th, arriving in Quebec in Hull, like how cold it must have been, and foreign, the language and all that. So I never got to know my grandfather. He died the year I was born in 1971. So that allowed me to imagine him at many stages of his life, like as a young kid, growing up as a teenager, growing up as an adult, one of the Bachelor Men's Society. So the irony thing about archiving is there was a register of when Chinese immigrants arrived, and they really did a job on documenting everything from their look, their height, where they came from, where they were going, and also if they had blemishes or scars, so they were really detailed and defined. So I found that register in the Canada Archives. I knew there was racism at a young age. I watched my grandparents suffer through that. In history class in high school, we were learning about French Canadian history and colonialism, and then they would point out the one colored person with the dark skin in class, and then they would suggest that was a savage, right? So then I looked around the class and I thought, I'm the only one dark skinned. So at a very young age, I knew I was different and I was gonna struggle. And my parents really tried to integrate and assimilate so our struggles would be lessened. So the register is a funny way for me to kind of like get to know my grandfather again. So I used a measuring tape to kind of identify and visualize him, like at a young child's age, paying $500 back in 1922. That was the salary of an adult's 2 years' wage. So it's these kind of histories that really impact me, and it brings me, I use my tangible links to history to kind of like reconcile, how do I move forward? This is my family's restaurant. It was called the Shanghai Restaurant. Yeah, there was a lot of history there. My parents were actually community builders in their own right. They spent a lot of energy, not just running the restaurant and operating it, doing everything. On their off time, they spent a lot of time helping new immigrants, like newcomers, come and settle. So setting them up with a house, setting them up with a job, sending them to school to learn English. Yeah, so my parents passed away just before COVID, and yeah, for me, like it was this whole archival thing and sharing our stories and capturing our histories. I feel like there's such a time sensitivity to it because, you know, it's nice that there's physical action happening and institutions are recognizing this, the need for this. Here, I did a series of men's clothing and was very bachelor inspired, men's Chinese bachelors. It was so I did this dress shirt, which was at Gallery 112 at the archives, and it's made out of Chinese takeout menus, and there's such a connection with food and culture, but you know, in a strange way, Chinese had to reimagine their culture. So there's a lot of resilience there, and a lot of storytelling with food. I created these two vests with photographs of kind of celebratory moments, family moments, eating dinners, very private moments. So they become scrapbooks of you know, artifacts that tell stories in our scrapbooks. So here's a close-up of the sweater vest, and this was actually a sweater vest that the waiters would wear over their vests in wintertime to stay warm, but also still look like they're in the role of a server. And I really love, this is a portrait of my parents when they got married and their friends and the siblings and the community that they built. Back then, Chinatown, Ottawa was very small. Originally, they were, you know, in the market and then on Bank Street. And then my parents decided to open up their own restaurant on Somerset Street, which is now currently still known as Chinatown. So this is really interesting because back then, Pierre Trudeau was the prime minister, and he had come and reserved the restaurant. And I remember growing up, him and Margaret and his family, they often reserved the restaurant. And I remember my dad was so ecstatic. He felt so embraced by Canada and the government and the politics being here in Ottawa, where his previous experiences were very negative with the head tax and all the racist, you know, laws. Here's a close-up of the men's dress shirt, which is made up of a variety of Chinese takeout menus. So in my process of like investigation, I always come across, you know, my own personal kind of like research, you know, images like this, white immigration, Oriental exclusion, was from 1907, an illustration to, you know, demonize Asian immigration. So for me to reconcile this, I love using my art to kind of like, kind of engage in conversations. So when I saw that image, I couldn't believe it. Like this country that I grew up in treated early Chinese settlers this way. So to make it real, I created a little maquette of the model in the image. And then recently I got to be part of a culture crawl where we created welcome mats in front of different storefronts. And this was at a really posh donut place in Wellington Street. And then during COVID, you know, life just ended for a lot of people. The world was on pause. my family's business was on pause. So, and then I found all these anti-Asian rhetoric was magnified all over again. So it was like all that research that I had done, historical research, a lot of similar anti-Asian sentiments came up. So to reconcile that, that same weekend, it was March 17th, I had created this pandemic mask. So then these are just different iterations of the mask. So currently I have about 14 of them traveling across Canada. And this piece is part of the collection at the ROM. I love this piece because we talk about, rising to the occasion. We have to show resilience and show our support. And how do we do that? I find like actions speak volumes. So during COVID, I would support a lot of the small mom and pop Chinese restaurants. And then here, this one on Golden Lake gave me a huge order, and I loved the bag, so I created a piece of artwork with it. And then here is another kind of iteration of a mask joining my parents. Often, Chinese ceremonies often are based in Buddhism and Taoism. So those who have passed are still alive. They're just in another state, and you can communicate with them. So this material is often burned as an offering to communicate with those who have passed. So then this is me in Picton, not taking a selfie with Johnny McDonald, but more in a confrontational eye-to-eye. And then Don Cherry, we all know what Don Cherry said. So this was my reaction. I just put a whole bunch of takeout menus through my printer, and I had created a series. The other ones were more about luck and resilience and strength and all the meanings behind it. And I love Kimberly Crenshaw's term intersectionality. My queerness often intersects with my heritage, and sometimes in Chinese culture there is no language for queerness. So this summer for Pride in Chinatown, this was the first time that the Chinese Gardens ever put a queer flag at their entrance. And then this is a sculpture. This lantern was a piece that I put outside to illuminate. Like a lot of cultures, when someone passes away, you light a candle or you say a prayer. So this piece I put outside in the wilderness in the Canadian landscape to kind of like, I imbued it with a lot of emotion, and it was put outside to kind of draw my dad's, his stories and his memory back. So I documented it for 2 years in all the seasons and all the harshness seasons, so winter, spring, summer, fall. And this series is actually currently at the Ottawa Art Gallery until January 23rd. So this piece is called This Land is My Land, This Land is Your Land, which you can actually currently see it at the Ottawa Art Gallery. It's in the Firestone collection. The Firestone collection is a collection made up of over 1,600 pieces collected by this very affluent family here in Ottawa, the Firestones. So through that process of investigating the collection, I noticed that there were a lot of gaps, like liminal spaces between cultures. So the lack of Indigenous artists' work, the lack of Black artists, the lack of Asian artists. There were no Chinese artists. So within 100 years, I was the first Chinese artist to engage with this very historic collection that is renowned for supporting the Group of Seven, for allowing the Group of Seven to be who they are today. So at first glance, you see this circle of Muskoka chairs. And then it looks very festive, looks like you want to be there, kind of enjoying life with a glass of wine. And then you look closer, and all the armrests are connected, and there's no entrance. There's no way into the circle. So you question yourself. You question like who belongs in the center, who belongs in the circle. My work is really personal, so it's like really emotional for me. This series is called Quiet Resistance, Reclaiming Space. I took the lantern frames and I brought them across Canada. Here it's in the Rockies. So me, it was in search of Gold Mountain. And then here is at Lake Louise. So it's about looking at the Canadian landscape, very much rooted in inclusion and exclusion, but looking at the landscape through like an Oriental lens. And then here is very close to home, Algonquin Park, Canoe Lake. And I'm so grateful for like opportunities like this, and that my art is being seen and my stories are being heard. This is a durational mural outside the Varley Art Gallery.